and get a shot against pertussis, which is also known as whooping cough.
Right.
Shortly after that, this huge military mobilization took place where young men from all over the country were joining the military to go fight in Europe. And the first cases of influenza, which was an H1N1 virus, broke out on an army base. And then as the soldiers were being, in the late spring, and as the soldiers were being loaded onto transport ships going across the Atlantic Ocean, and that journey took anywhere from 10 to 14 days or even longer, confined in very close quarters. By the time they got to Europe, thousands upon thousands of these young recruits were infected with a febrile illness. They were infected with influenza. And surprisingly, many of them succumbed. They would be, the typical pattern was a healthy young soldier would come down with a fever and a headache, maybe a sore throat one day, and by the next day he was dead.
Wow.
And he would be dead of a pneumonia that apparently filled the lungs with fluid, so that essentially these soldiers suffocated to death on their own lung secretions brought about by this H1N1 virus.
That seemed like to be a fast.
That's very fast. You see, so you used the word novel virus. Well, that was very novel. Influenza had been known about, going back almost as far as we can trace it in ancient times. In fact, the name influenza comes from a Latin root, which basically means influence.
Right.
Because it was felt that this illness that seemed to appear out of nowhere was due to some heavenly or divine influence, a cursing of the gods.
Oh.
And it would break out in various places, and people would become ill, and sometimes they would die. But generally speaking, influenza then, as now, was not looked at by the general population as something that was an extremely dangerous, fatal disease, although there were always some degree of mortality. But the mortality seemed to be among the very young and the very old. So that was the historical pattern of influenza down through the ages. But now, 1918 and 1919, we have a different pattern.
Oh, okay.
Where it's not the very young and the very old that are getting sick, or if they get sick, they are not the ones that die. The ones that get sick and die in a very quick way are the young, healthy people. Those that are, above the age of 16 to 50, who are at the peak of their physical powers. These seem to be the ones that are most vulnerable to this novel virus in 1918 and 1919 that was called at the time the Spanish flu.
Oh, okay.
Now there's different stories as to why it was called the Spanish flu. Some say, well, the United States had just fought a war with Spain not so long in the past, in 1899, and so the Spaniards were the bad guys, so name a disease after the bad guys. The other version of the story is that some of the troops that were sent overseas in World War I were stationed in Spain, and this is where one of the early outbreaks occurred.
Okay.
And so it was connected in some way to Spain. So it's been known since that time as the Spanish flu. But the Spanish flu was a swine flu, was an H1N1 virus, and it had an atypical, which is to say unusual, presentation. Number one, it began in the late spring, which is the end of the normal flu season.
Right.
Just when you think flu is winding down, now all of a sudden there is a rather mild outbreak in the spring of 1918.
Similar to this case.
Similar to what we're experiencing now. A relatively mild outbreak in the late spring of 2009.
Right.
And then it moves overseas to Europe. And although public health surveillance at that time isn't what it is now, but presumably during the summer months of 1918, it spread throughout Europe and Asia, Africa, the Isles of the Pacific, Australia, Central and South America, and continued to spread in North America. So that then the second wave, if you will, hit during the regular flu season in 1919, in the late fall of 1918 going into the winter of 1919, the second wave of this Spanish flu hit, and something had happened. This relatively mild virus that had appeared the previous spring suddenly had increased virulence, which is to say it caused a much more serious illness, and the mortality rate rose. The majority of people in the United States got infected that winter of 1919. And before it was over, 600,000 had died.
Right. Yeah, the numbers were astronomical.
Yes, just as we saw this spring, schools being shut down and public places, public events being canceled in Mexico, and then later on in New York City and cities around the United States. That's what it was like in 1919, where cities like Philadelphia were completely shut down, where factories were shut down, schools closed for months at a time, colleges shut down. And one of the surprising twists and ironies of history, the influenza produced peace, because the armies that were deployed against one another in Europe could no longer fight because there were too many soldiers who were down and sick from influenza. And more soldiers died of the Spanish flu than ever died of poison gas and bullets, from battle. So where we are now, late summer of 2009, we are in between what was a mild outbreak in the spring, and we don't know what awaits us in the fall at the beginning of the normal flu season in late October going into November, and then throughout the winter in 2010. But if in any way there's a duplication of the pattern of the swine flu, called the Spanish flu, from 1918 and 1919, then this could be very devastating indeed.
I have two questions for you. I know, well, number one, they have talked about, and now you just brought context to why they say, well, we're gearing up for the fall, when this flu could come and be much more devastating, much more virulent than it is now. So you're almost, listening to your words now, I can see that some people are thinking that, but they're not talking that.
Yes.
And then the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, do you think, was there any knowledge of how it spread so fast in such a...
You mean then?
Yes, sir. From 1918 to, was any actions taken, or did it just...
Well, I mean, just keep in mind, again, from a historical point of view, there was no scientific understanding of the nature of a virus. In 1918 and 1919, nobody knew what caused it.
Okay.
I believe the first description of viruses didn't occur until the 1930s.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure what the exact date was, but so this was an unknown. This was just something that was completely mysterious, and nobody quite understood what was going on, much less the transmission. It was clear, however, that it was